The campaign against the war in Vietnam in the late 1960s and early 1970s was central to Australian politics. As the movement grew, it drew in many who simply wanted the return of Australian troops and an end to Australia's involvement. Importantly, workers joined moratoriums, political weekday strikes against the war. But others were won to a more radical position, to opposition to imperialism, and they argued for the victory of the Vietnamese liberation forces. Students played a major role in the radical wing of the movement. Today we're talking to Janusz Ebel, better known as John, who was a student at the relatively new Trobe University in the northern suburbs of Melbourne in this period. John was one of those who burnt his draft card. He also took part in 1970 in what became known as the Battle of Waterdale Road. It was the day the Victorian police tried to bludgeon student demonstrators into submission and failed. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm, or Melbourne. So welcome, John.
It will be good to talk about these events because they were extremely significant for the changes that occurred later with the election of the Whitlam government as well.
Okay. Well, look, perhaps we can start with you sketching the political situation in 1970. What was happening in the anti-war movement, and specifically, what was the state of the movement at La Trobe?
I came to La Trobe the year before in 1969. At that stage, I was already somewhat involved with Students for Democratic Society, which was based at Melbourne University. And I had a centre called Centre for Democratic Action in Palmerston Street in Carlton. Actually, I think I still remember the number, 57. It was an old pub where some key activists were living upstairs, and the ground floor and the cellar were converted into a hive of radical activity with silk screen printing, posters, gestetness and offsets, which are very new, printing leaflets for demonstrations at universities and also in the city.
The anti-war movement started out quite modestly in the 60s with small numbers and fairly modest politics. By 1970, how big was the radical anti-imperialist section of the movement?
Well, it all started with a number of women who were in SOS Save Our Sons, and they were demonstrating in a city square, what used to be the city square. They were being arrested because Victoria had these laws against the gathering of, I think, 6 people. If 6 people gathered, they could be arrested. But I came from Poland in 1961 as a young teenager, and I remember going into the city. It probably would have been 66. And these women were handing out leaflets and being arrested. And I was quite curious. I picked up the leaflets and read them and so on. The question you ask, in 1969, 1970, the movement was still very embryonic. There were a number of people who were draft resistors. I burned my draft card on July the 4th, 1970. And that was the first big draft card burning of a number of, I don't know how big it, well, actually it wasn't all that big. It was in Melbourne, it was at Melbourne University and at La Trobe, and there were about 5 of us at La Trobe, and probably a similar number at Melbourne University. The currents that were around at that stage were mostly amongst young people. There was the Monash Labour Club, and it had a number of people from different political tendencies. But probably the main influence was Albert Lenger and Michael Hyde, who went to China and came back as convinced Maoists, but theoretically very primitive. They raised donations for the NLF, which was the National Liberation Front, in South Vietnam, allied with the North. That caused a huge controversy in the media. As far as La Trobe was concerned, when I first came, I joined the Labour Club. Now, the Labour Club at La Trobe wasn't affiliated to the Australian Labour Party. It was a leftist club and an independent one. Yeah, some of them became actually prominent in Labour Party politics, but most of us were interested mainly in protesting against the war. Now, when I came to La Trobe, as I said, I was already involved with the Students for Democratic Society, which was very much influenced by the American SDS. The American SDS was a student movement which arose probably from the left of the Democratic Party. But my main interest in it was that they were advocating participatory democracy. When I was still at high school, I read people like Bertrand Russell, and I remember taking a very strong interest in Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal, which was taking place in Stockholm, in Sweden, in 1967. It was chaired by a group of people. One of them was Sartre. Simone de Beauvoir was involved, and Isaac Deutscher, who I was already reading. And that was quite influential. What was interesting about all this was, in Australia at the time, even though the media was fairly conservative, these kinds of events, it was publicized.
And this was putting the US on trial.
It was putting the United States on trial. The Age actually at the time was reporting every day what was happening at this trial. So, and even the Herald, which was different to the Sun Herald today, was reporting that and publishing syndicated articles from a revolutionary Marxist like Isaac Deutscher.
Can we come back to the question of draft cards? For many listeners, they may be unclear what a draft card was. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was part of the process of conscription. There was essentially a lottery process by which young men were going to be called up for military service in Vietnam. And so burning your draft card was actually a very radical act, because it was saying that you were not prepared to fight. What was it like doing it, and what was the response? Because at that stage you still would have been in a minority.
We were in a huge minority. I knew of only one person who refused to go to the army. He didn't burn his draft card, but that was Daniel Zarb. And Daniel was imprisoned. If you went on the train, there were various signs saying "Free Zarb" painted on various brick walls and so on. When I was 16, I was sent a letter asking me if I wanted to become an Australian citizen. And I thought, oh yeah, why not? So I did. I became an Australian citizen. A few years later, another letter came. It said that I was lucky enough to be balloted out to go into the Australian Army when the Australian Army was sending people to Vietnam. And this was before I went to La Trobe, and I thought, at the time, I was very interested in what was going on, actually. Because of my background, I come from a Holocaust survivor family and so on. But we also lived in South Melbourne, and Lyndon Johnson was visiting Australia, and it was just fairly close to where I lived.
And he was the President of the United
Exactly.
States.
And he was going through on a cavalcade through St Kilda Road, and just near fairly close to where I lived, someone threw a bucket of red paint on his car. And that was big news. I didn't see it, but I remember anyway reading about it. But the interesting thing was, it obviously came up before I was sent this letter being called to serve in the Australian military. I was thinking about it, and I thought, what would I do if I was balloted out? My thoughts at the time were, when I was still at school, I wouldn't go because, first of all, I had nothing against the Vietnamese people. And secondly, I thought, I'm not going to go and do the kind of things that I was watching on television and reading about what was happening in Vietnam. You could actually, on newsreels and on television news, they were showing the actual napalming and burning of villages. It was quite open, something that we do not get in the very much more controlled media today. I remember actually in this context coming home one day, and my mum was watching direct footage from Vietnam, and the first thing I saw, I remember I walked into the lounge room, the first thing I saw was the burning of villages when they were torching, American soldiers torching villages. It was like a footage from Oliver Stone's film Platoon.
With the burning of the draft cards, I assume that was a public protest. How did it play out? Did you stand there and burn the card? Was there media? Were you immediately in trouble afterwards?
I recall talking to people at Melbourne Uni, and we coordinated. We called the media, both for the Melbourne University campus and for the La Trobe. So we had all the television stations and all the print media were there. At La Trobe, I still remember my former draft card burners. There was David Mercer, David Mueller, Ian MacDonald, Roger Nefty, and myself, 5 of us. We were next to the bookshop in the Agora at La Trobe University, and the whole La Trobe University campus was upstairs, which would have been, in those days, it was a small university. It just began. I think the university had maybe like 3,000 or 4,000 people at the most. Most of the campus was there watching us, because we publicized it, and people knew, through leaflets and word of mouth and so on, that we were going to burn our draft cards. Well, the media was there, and I burned my draft card with the others. There was a shot of me which appeared on the front page of the Herald, a big shot, like smiling and burning my draft card. This was on July the 4th, 1970. I remember when I got home, my dad and my mum greeted me, and my dad started laughing, and he said, I had a phone call from your sister's boyfriend. My dad said, he rang me a few hours ago and he said that I should buy the Herald and see what my son did. And I asked him, what did he do? And he told me that you ruined your life. I asked him, what happened? He said, well, your son just burnt his draft card and he's on the front page of the Herald and he's ruined his future. And my dad said, well, I had a bit of a laugh. He basically told me, well, look, you're a rebel like me and I'm very proud of you.
That's exactly the response that you would hope for. How did the authorities respond?
The following morning, I'm still in my bedroom. It must have been about 7 o'clock in the morning. There's a knock on the door, and I kind of suspected that it was the Commonwealth Police. Now it's called the Federal Police. So my sister went to open the door through the grill, right? And the police were at the front door and they said, is John Ebel here? And my sister said, no, he's not. And she slammed the door in the face. And I left. And after that, nothing much happened till later, like quite a few months later. Although what I should say is that what's interesting about this, it's not just draft card burning, but when I was involved with Students for Democratic Society at Melbourne Uni, we were involved in what I suppose we saw as guerrilla actions. And what we did, and this was in 1969, we were into occupying the offices of government ministers. This was before the burning of the draft cards. And I remember we went to Billy Snedden's office. Billy Snedden at that stage was the Minister for National Service. And he had an office in East Melbourne, very luxurious offices. About 15 of us entered his office and we locked ourselves in. I think it was Michael Hamill Green or Harry Van Most, or both of them, called the media. And the kind of security doors they had there, where they had these doors which were like bank vaults virtually. The police came. It would have been probably Michael Hamill Green and Harry who wrote a statement which was given to Snedden saying that we will not be charged for entering his office, and we tried to engage him in a conversation and that he was complicit with war crimes and so on and so forth. It was an interesting event. It got lots of publicity. The police came with actually oxyacetylene torches because they couldn't get in and they were burning. It was hilarious actually. That they were trying to burn the logs, which would have taken them hours. And the media was there filming it all. And it appeared on the evening news later. Yes, Snedden completely melted. He had like a nervous breakdown. He started crying. And he said, he confessed to us that he really didn't want to be in this kind of a ministry that he was given. He told us about his background, that he was from a working class family and joined the Liberal Party when he became a lawyer and all this kind of stuff. And I remember we had a conference of Students for Democratic Society in Sydney at the beginning of 1970, and we were doing similar things. We occupied the offices of Gorton, although unfortunately Gorton wasn't there.
Okay, let's turn now to the Battle of Waterdale Road. First of all, tell us what happened the night before. So we're talking about September 1970. You've told me that shots were fired at student protesters. What was going on?
What happened was members of the La Trobe Labour Cup, we were putting up posters about the march from Northland. The first moratorium was going to be on, and we were organising this march to publicise the opposition to the war and getting people interested and getting them to join us. So we had posters. I remember my father lent me his car, and I went with Ian Coulter, someone I knew from the Labour Club, and we went out and put up posters. We were getting back to La Trobe because all of us, it must have been like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, probably 2 o'clock actually at night. There would have been about 25 of us who decided to meet back at the university and to see how things went and that everybody was okay and safe. Now, as we went into the Chisholm car park, I said to Ian, because I had very good hearing in those days, I said to Ian, "Did you hear that? It sounded like shots." And I said to him, "I think we better dive onto the floor of the car." So I put all the seats back, and the shots were going on for probably 5 to 10 minutes. When they stopped, I said, "Let's wait for a while." And we exited and we went back to Chisholm College, where Jen Shepard and Philippa Shepard, two sisters, lived. And the meeting was at Jen's place. When we got there, Jen was absolutely hysterical. She was crying. She said, what I remember vividly was, I heard a bullet past my ear. I remember the next morning picking up The Age. The Age had a report about it. We found out later that the people who were shooting at us were apparently security guards. It was horrific.
Well, that's obviously, in some sense, a curtain raiser for what happened on September the 16th, 1970, when you and many others decided to march from the Northland Shopping Centre to La Trobe University. And for those who don't know the area or don't know Melbourne, Waterdale Road runs north-south through the northern suburbs of Melbourne, starting in the south in Ivanhoe, runs through Heidelberg, quite close to Northlands, and then ends pretty much at the gates of La Trobe University. So on that day you were marching, and on that day the police rioted. I've got in front of me the front page of The Age from the 24th of September 1970, where the debate was still raging about the events you're going to tell us about. And there's a picture there on the front page of The Age, of a police officer with his fist raised, about to punch a student demonstrator in the back of the head. Now, that was clearly just part of what happened. So can you talk us through the Battle of Waterdale Road?
Well, I remember we were marching with banners and all this kind of stuff and giving out leaflets to people at Northland and also on the way back to La Trobe. We were approaching La Trobe University. We were fairly close, and there were some university flats, I remember, on the right. Looking at the street, and I thought, this is a bit strange. Why are there so many cars parked there today? Unmarked, just normal sedans. We are near these cars, and suddenly the doors open, and police in plain uniforms at this stage jumped out with batons and started attacking us. Within 5 minutes, buses arrived full of uniformed police who got out of the buses with truncheons and so on and started attacking us. Now, I was with a friend. She was expecting a baby in probably 3 months. There was this melee, and I could see my friend being attacked by the police. I picked up a stone from the road to divert this policeman and threw it at his back. He turned around and started chasing me. Now, a few years before that, I came third in the inter-school sports in 100 yards, so I was a pretty fast runner. And I remember, it was quite funny. There's Waterdale Road, the police are kind of this melee, like hitting people, and I'm trying to escape this cop. And I'm running, and they're running after me, but they can't catch me. There is a whole crowd of people, students from La Trobe, who came to watch, and they're cheering me on, you know. And of course, running so fast, I was just running straight, and I ran into this phalanx of police who were at the other end, next to the flats, the La Trobe University flats, so as not to let anybody through, right? And I ran straight into them. Now, of course, I was arrested. I faced court and I was defended by a good Maoist lawyer called John Little. I denied everything. And the police got the story wrong, so the magistrate threw it out.
How many people were injured and arrested? Because it sounds like, well, clearly the police ambushed you. They were trying to do you harm, not just you personally, but all the protesters. What was the outcome in terms of arrests, injuries, and so on?
A lot of us were arrested. I remember we were first taken to Heidelberg police station. Then we were taken to City Watch House. As far as injuries went, some people had their heads bloodied and all this kind of stuff.
Why do you think the police carried out such an orchestrated ambush? There must have been, by 1970, a lot of anti-war protest activity. Clearly they were trying to make a point by ambushing you that day.
I think
Why did they go in so hard?
I think it was the Balti government.
Which was a Liberal Party government.
Yeah. They tried to ban protests, as I mentioned, with the Save Our Sons movement. And by 1970, there was a lot of dissent already happening. July the 4th became a time when students mainly went and protested outside the American embassy in St Kilda Road. Balti, who was the premier, and his ministers were vicious. The chief of police in Victoria, I remember his name, Platfus. After this event where the police attacked us, the following day there was a headline in The Age which quoted Platfus. He said they got some baton yesterday, and if they come back tomorrow, we'll give them more baton. And that was his mindset. I imagine they were influenced by what was going also in the United States, the repression at, for instance, the Democratic Party convention in Chicago, when the police rioted and injured and disabled and maybe I think even killed a number of students and protesters a couple of years before the Trobe University.
What was the political fallout from the police ambush? Because the front page of The Age that I've got here, it's the main story with pictures of the attack, and that's 8 days after the demonstration took place. So clearly it wasn't a minor news story, it was a big news story. What was the response from the student movement? Was there solidarity from the Labour Party? Was there solidarity from the union movement?
What happened was when this Waterdale battle occurred, there were a lot of, in those days, there were a lot of workshops, small factories and auto shops along Waterdale Road where we were attacked. There were all these workers, in various places, and they came out to help us battle the police. In fact, I still remember some of these workers came out with some of the tools that they had, and they were getting into the police. And I don't recall the police actually attacking any of them, or arresting any of them, I should say. At that stage, we were also going like SDS, and later on, when I was involved with resistance, this was later, we used to go to factories and to the docks and talk to workers about what was happening in Vietnam, the fact that we were trying to organize protests and so on. We got at lunchtimes and so on. I remember going to the Docklands and talking to the waterside workers, painters and dockers and all that kind of stuff.
And the Age story actually highlights a call from the Labour Party, who were in opposition, for an inquiry into the police violence. Now, it was very legalistic and parliamentary, but nonetheless, it's clear that the Labour Party was calling out the police violence. Would you say, politically speaking, that the anti-Vietnam War movement won the Battle of Waterdale Road? You may not have won the fist fight because the police are always better armed, but did you come out of it winning the political battle?
Definitely, and I think it was part of the snowballing of the opposition to the Vietnam War. We were involved every day, actually. We were involved in some kind of action. I was at that time doing my science degree, my second year in science, physics and so on. And by that stage, I thought, I'm not going to continue with my science degree. I was still enrolled, but most of my time was spent as an activist.
Today we're seeing growing repression of the right to protest, not just in Victoria, but in other states. We've also been involved for more than 15 months now in a solidarity campaign for Palestine, which in many ways is unprecedented in terms of the number of people it's involved, how quickly and in what large numbers. So there was a fight against imperialism in 1970, there's a fight against imperialism in 2025. Looking back on your activity as an anti-war activist, not specifically just the Battle of Waterdale Road, but the totality of the movement, what conclusions would you draw that would help activists who are fighting for Palestine today?
It's a good question. I would say, first of all, be involved in risky situations. So what I described before in terms of occupations of ministers. I remember actually at La Trobe we occupied the Vice-Chancellor's office. The other thing is that be aware that if you are committed, make sure you are fully committed.
So to summarise, I think what you're telling us is audacity, and more audacity, and political clarity. And you're speaking as someone who, from the period we've just been discussing through to today, you've been a revolutionary socialist, you've been a Trotskyist all that time, and I think it's that political clarity which means that you're able to share with us the insights from 1970 that you've shared with us today. So thank you very much, John. We appreciate your time, and I hope that some of those ideas and some of those memories will help inspire a new generation of anti-imperialist fighters.